The Wolf Dog by Walt Morey. Chapter 4. Andy wakened with his father's big hand shaking him, his voice saying gently, "Andy, wake up, Andy, wake up." Andy started up, clutching the rifle. The fire had sunk to a bed of glowing coals. The dog lay on the broken wing tip as he had been, motionless. Andy rubbed his eyes. In spite of the freezing cold and the wolves running the ridge tops, he had slept several hours. His father was saying, "When it was way after dark and you still didn't come home, we got worried. It's awfully easy to fall and break a leg or something." "I'm glad you came," Andy said. "I was played out. I had to stop." His father looked down at the still form of the dog and asked, "Where did you find Smiley Johnson?" "About 2 miles back. He came down in a little clearing on the valley floor. He's still in the plane. He didn't even have a chance to get out of the seat. I found the dog in an iron crate about 50 feet away. It had been thrown right through the side of the plane." Kurt Evans shook his head. "Too bad. Too bad. Smiley was a good flyer. Too good. He got careless and cocksure. He was long overdue for trouble." He knelt and looked at the motionless dog. "So this is Kvik, the wild dog that won the North American." He ran his big hand lightly down the dog's body and over the wolf-like head. "I'd like to have seen him before this happened. Too bad you dragged him this far. He's almost dead. You should have put him out of his misery." "I tried to, but at the last minute he opened his eyes and looked at me." Andy searched for words to explain what that look had done to him, but he could find none. "If he'd been running or had jumped me, or if he had just hadn't looked at me, I could have done it." "Maybe it's just as well," his father said. "We'll take him in, if he lives to make it that far. Mr. Hunter will know we made every effort to save his dog. Well, let's tie him on the sled and get moving." It took but a minute to fasten Kvik. Then his father slipped the rope over his shoulders, leaned his big chest into the loop, and moved off effortlessly. Andy followed, carrying his rifle and pack-sack. They made the full distance home without a stop. At home, Andy and his father carried Kvik, still on the wingtip, into the kitchen. They laid him carefully on the floor. Andy's mother said, "What on earth? Where did you get a dog?" She kissed Andy. "You had me worried staying out this way. Now get out of that parka. I've kept your supper hot." Her eyes went to Kvik again, then up at Andy's father. She caught her breath and stood perfectly still, her gray eyes wide with shock, as Kurt told her what had happened. At the end, she murmured, "Poor Smiley. He never would believe he couldn't fly through any storm. 'Put wings on the coffee pot,' he used to say, 'and I'll fly it.'" She looked at the dog again. "What are you going to do with him?" "I'll have to leave him here for a while," Kurt explained. "I've got to go to the airport and tell Swede Eklund to call off the search and arrange for a party to go out and bring Smiley in. And I'd better call Mr. Hunter long distance and ask him what he wants to do about his dog." "Dad," Andy asked anxiously, "what will you tell him?" Kurt Evans dug big fingers through his short brown hair and studied Kvik. "I'll have to tell him how he seems to me," he said finally. "How's that, Dad?" "Almost dead." After his father had left, Andy knelt beside Kvik, loosened the ropes about him, stroked his head, and looked anxiously for some change for the better. There was none. Laura stole glances at her son as she bustled about, getting his dinner on the table. She sat across from him and watched him pick absently at his food, frowning and silent. Finally she asked, "Andy, when did you find Kvik?" "About 3 o'clock," he said, not looking up. "And you're wrapped up in him already." "I guess so." Andy looked up, his eyes very blue. "I never felt this way about a dog or anything else before." He shook his head, at a loss to explain the sick shock that had rushed over him at the sight of the wreck, with Smiley sitting dead in the plane, and Kvik lying in the cage, trapped and helpless. The heavy feeling of death hung over the little clearing. He visualized the dog lying there through the blizzard, and following the 2 days of bitter cold with no one to care for him and nothing to eat and drink. Wild animals had tried to get at him and rip him to pieces. A great sympathy had welled up in Andy. He ran fingers through his hair with the same gesture his father used. "Maybe I should have put him out of his misery," he said. "But after all he'd been through, I couldn't do it. He was trying so hard to live. He needed all the help he could get." "Of course," Laura smiled. "I'm glad you brought him home." Andy finished his dinner, helped his mother with the dishes, and was bending over Kvik again when his father returned. "What did Mr. Hunter say?" Andy asked immediately. Kurt Evans looked at his son soberly. "He said, 'Take the dog out and shoot him.'" "But he's not dead." "He's practically dead. You were going to shoot him." "But I didn't, Dad. What did you tell Mr. Hunter?" "I told him how the dog seemed to me, that he's got broken bones and probably internal injuries, that he's unconscious most of the time. I told him that there's not a veterinary within 2,000 miles, and that I didn't think the dog would live to be taken that far if I could find one." Did you have to make it sound so bad? I learned long ago that Mr. Hunter wants all the facts, and not hopeful guesses and surmises. I gave him the facts as I see them. I'm not exactly an amateur with dogs, you know. But Kvik might live, Andy argued. I didn't think he'd live till we got him home, but he has, and he doesn't look any worse now than when I found him. He couldn't and still breathe, Kurt said flatly. It's no use, Andy. Mr. Hunter said what to do, and he expects me to do it. I think he's right. He reached for Andy's rifle behind the door. I wish I could have given him a promising report, but I honestly couldn't. Andy knew his father for a gentle, compassionate man who thought things out carefully and slowly. There seemed to be no argument. Then he thought of one last thing. Why can't we have Dr. Walker look at him first? Vic Walker is a medical doctor, not a vet. He is a doctor, Andy argued. He can tell us things. Kurt shook his big head. Why can't you give up, Andy? Laura had sat, slim hands folded on the table, watching her two men argue. Now she said quietly, Why shouldn't he give up, Kurt? Common sense ought to tell him it's no use, and you too. Having Vic Walker look at this dog makes a lot of sense to me. He can make a diagnosis. On a dog? He is a doctor. That's right, a doctor, not a vet, Kurt said half angrily. He won't come out here to look at a dog. I know Vic Walker. I know him too. I think he might come. Andy, seeing he was getting help, said quickly, I'll ask him, Dad, and I'll pay it out of my trapping money. Kurt turned on his son. Why do you care what happens to this dog? He's not yours. I'm sorry for him. If you could have seen him trapped in that cage. I feel sorry for him too. Then why kill him? Laura cut in. Don't start twisting things around. Don't start twisting things around, Kurt warned. What's got into you, Laura? Where's your good sense? Kurt, Laura said gently, don't you think it's amazing Kvik's lived at all the past 3 days? Of course, it's the wolf in him that's living. Doesn't he deserve the benefit of every doubt, after putting up such a gallant fight? Kurt scowled and shifted the rifle uncomfortably to his other hand. Vic Walker wouldn't come out here to look at a dog, he repeated. It can't do him any harm to ask him. Then Laura added, her shrewdest clincher. It would be the final proof to Mr. Hunter that you've done everything humanly possible. Vic'll be in bed, Kurt argued. It's 11 o'clock. No, he won't. Andy was beginning to see a ray of hope. He usually stays up late reading. He says it's the only time he gets to read any more. Well, Kurt rubbed his face uncertainly. Oh, all right. But don't you give Walker a bad time. Don't make a nuisance of yourself. If he says no, that's it. You come right back home. You understand? I will, Andy promised. He was getting into his parka as he ran for the door. Dr. Walker was a bachelor. He lived in a neat white house at the end of Copper City's one street. The front part of the house was his office. He lived in the rear. There was a light in his living quarters when Andy pounded on the door. Dr. Walker, wearing carpet slippers and an old robe, answered the door. He was tall and lean, about Andy's father's age. He had snapping eyes and straight black hair beginning to thin on top. Andy, what brings you out this time of night? His voice sounded grumpy and annoyed. Can you come to the house right away? Andy asked. Dr. Walker looked at him, then grunted and began slipping out of the robe. Accident? He asked. Sort of. Can you hurry? Andy mumbled. Happens every time, Walker grumbled to himself. Can't get sick or hurt in the daytime so they can come to the office. Got to wait till the middle of the night. What's wrong? He asked, buckling his overshoes. Your dad hurt? Dad's all right. He's with Mother. Your mother, eh? What's wrong with Laura? Andy just stood there. All his fine courage had leaked away in the face of Dr. Walker's forbidding manner. He feared if he told the doctor that he was taking him out to see a dog, he'd never go. Dr. Walker didn't seem to notice Andy's hesitation. Laura's always been pretty healthy. He took up his bag. Let's go. Outside there was no chance to talk, and Andy was glad. He was hard put to match the doctor's long, swinging legs. They passed through the dense woods into the house in a matter of minutes. Andy held his breath as they entered the kitchen. Dr. Walker growled at his father. Kurt, fine time to get a man out. What's wrong with Laura? He saw Kvik and turned to Andy, eyes snapping. You brought me out here to treat a dog? Didn't he tell you? Kurt Evans asked. Walker's eyes dug into Andy's accusingly. He let me believe Laura was sick. Andy looked at his father. I just said you were with Mother. You let me jump to a conclusion, Walker said angrily. I didn't know what to say. I was afraid he wouldn't come if I told him it was for Kvik. You bet I wouldn't. I've had a long day. I managed to steal a few minutes to read, and what happens? I am dragged out in the middle of the night. of winter night to look at a dog. A dog! Laura said, Andy should have told you, Vic. He was supposed to. But you can understand why he wouldn't. Now, as long as you're here, would you mind looking at the dog? Yes, I mind, Walker said shortly. I'm a doctor. I don't treat mutts, especially mutts that look like wolves. This is no average mutt, Kurt said. This is the lead dog of the sled team that just won the North American at Fairbanks. Well, bully for him, Walker said acidly. This is the dog Smiley Johnson was flying out when he was lost. Walker stopped. Smiley's been found? Good. And he found him. Smiley's dead. That's too bad. But the way he flew, it was bound to happen. Where'd he crash? On Andy's trapline up in the valley. Kvik's laid out there ever since the crash, trapped in an iron cage, Laura added. Quite an ordeal, Walker observed dryly. Vic, Laura said, this dog has been through an awful lot and he's still alive. I know it's taking advantage of an old friend, but won't you at least look at him? Walker hesitated, and she added, what possible harm can that do? Well, Walker finally agreed. All right. He knelt beside Kvik, opened his bag, and took out the stethoscope. Andy watched anxiously as Dr. Walker listened to Kvik's heart, took his temperature, looked at his eyes, pried open his mouth, and examined his gums. He ran his long hands down the dog's flanks, probing gently. At last he sat back on his heels and looked up. Well, Laura asked. He's got broken ribs and a broken leg. He's in shock. He can't swallow, his pelvis may be broken, and he may have internal injuries that only an X-ray would show, and he's running a temperature. Isn't there anything good? Laura asked. His pulse isn't bad, considering. About the best I can say is that his heart's beating and he's breathing. Could a good vet bring him through? Andy's father asked. It'd be a nip and a tuck. Where'd you find one? I don't know. Even if a vet saved him, Dr. Walker observed, his chances of full recovery are slim. My advice is to put him to sleep. I'll do that if you like. No, Andy cried instantly. Can't you doctor him like you do people? A vet doesn't doctor people, Dr. Walker said, and I don't doctor animals. I suppose there's a great difference, Andy's mother observed. A doctor couldn't possibly treat a dog. He wouldn't know how. Oh, we could, Walker admitted grudgingly. We use dogs for lab experiments. But that's not like doctoring them, like setting broken bones and giving them medicines. A broken bone is a broken bone, Dr. Walker said. As for medicines, some are interchangeable. I didn't realize the treatment of people and dogs is so much alike. Most people don't. Dr. Walker replaced the stethoscope in his bag, closed it, and rose. Laura continued, following her line of reasoning. But you'd put Kvik to sleep. If Andy were injured in the same way Kvik is, you'd let him die? Don't sound stupid, Laura, Walker said sharply. There's a lot I could do. Then do it for Kvik, Laura said quietly. Dr. Walker looked at her a long moment, his sharp eyes boring into her calm face. He shook a long finger at her and growled positively. You don't trap me like that. There's more to this than just treating a dog. Suppose this town should learn I'd used the same medicines, the same instruments to operate on this dog and that I used on their wives and husbands and kids. The fact is that everything is sterilized would make no difference. If I use medicines and instruments meant for humans on a dog, pretty soon they'd be asking which certificate I had, one to practice on dogs and cats, or one for people. They'd crucify me, run me out of town. I hadn't thought about that, Andy's father agreed. Folks up here wouldn't stand for it. Then take care of Kvik here, Laura suggested. Dr. Walker shook his head. He needs intravenous feeding, x-rays for internal injuries. He should be checked every couple of hours. Somebody'd start asking why I was coming out here so often. Just forget the whole thing, Laura. It won't work. Andy knew his mother wasn't listening. She was biting in a fingernail thoughtfully. Victor, she mused, your house sits at the end of the street, almost up against the trees, doesn't it? You know it does. That trail we take down comes out practically at your back door. Kurt and Andy could take Kvik through the woods and into your house without even being seen. You could fix up a place for him in the back room, and you'd have him there where you could do all the things necessary and look in on him, whenever you liked. No one need ever know. When Kvik is well enough, Kurt and Andy can bring him home the same way. Dr. Walker was shaking his head emphatically all through Laura's plan. The moment she finished, he said, That's a crazy idea. No! You mean it wouldn't work? Or you can't do anything for Kvik? Oh, it might work. Then you can do as much for Kvik as you could do for Andy. You're not making sense. Dr. Walker towered over Andy's mother and shook a finger under her nose. He drew an angry breath, then let it out slowly and stood looking at her. Laura, he said finally, I never won an argument with you even when we were kids. Now I know why. You've got it all plotted out. You know every move. You know the end before you start an argument. You're not honest. I'm glad you married Kurt and not me." Andy's mother smiled. "Then you'll do it?" He continued to glare at her. Finally he threw up his hands. "All right. Anything to get you off my back." He turned to Andy's father. "You fellows carry the dog on that wing slab, and don't shake him around or jolt him. And don't let the whole town see you. I'll go home and have the back door open." Kurt Evans said, "Vic, you said the dog's chances for a full recovery are slim." "Sometimes less than 50-50. Kurt turned to Andy, his face grim. "You hear? Mr. Henry won't have a cripple. If at any time Dr. Walker says he's not going to make a full recovery, we destroy him. No arguments, no nothing. Still want to try to save him?" Andy looked at Dr. Walker, a grim, still, angry man. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes," he said. "Yes." Here, Dr. Walker turned to leave, then stopped. "If anybody here so much as breathes one word of this," he warned, "I'll haunt the three of you till Judgment Day." "Victor," Laura said. "Now what?" "Thank you." Dr. Walker grunted. He gave her his sourest look, jammed on his hat, and went out without a word.